Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first monthly webinar from Digital. The webinar is going to be conducted by Dr. Chris Prue. I will let him introduce himself. We have also my colleague, Oscar Mondrian, and we look forward to your participation with us. To you, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Rana. So thank you all for coming. So this is a version that has been going on in French. So we just wanted to add an English version. But I know that there are still many people from around the world that English may be a second language, and so I will try to speak appropriately, slowly, and clearly. And so this is the first of a series we're going to be doing. It's going to be repetitive, but the way that we're going to approach it is we're going to overview, how to look at the analysis, and we'll be starting with running, and then we'll be looking at, we're going to be starting with walking, then we'll be looking at running, and then we'll be looking at our latest launch, which is the performance rehab module, which I might show you a little something later on. So what we're doing maybe a little bit different is we're going to show and go through how to read the analysis of the Digital Pro system. So if you're familiar with the PhotoSmart, there's some similarities. There's a few differences, but we're going to go through it, and we're going to use a condition or a pathology, a different one, every single month. So we're going to begin with looking at an elderly screening, so an analysis that was taken on an elderly patient, and use that as the background to run through the analysis. So we're very relaxed here. It's not formal. I am going to try and get through it, but if there are any questions, we'll be able to address those, and we'll have plenty of time. All right, so I'm going to share my screen.
By the time you share your screen, I just want to mention that on the bottom right side of the screen, you have a chat and the questions tab. You are welcome to type in your questions anytime. And I think at the end, Chris will answer them all. Also, within a while, I'll be passing to you a few poll questions so that we can know you better and target our training in a better way to you. And at the end, I'll include the email that you can write to us on, as you will be entitled if you attend this webinar, or if you watch the video replay completely, you will be entitled to request an attendance certificate by sending us an email.
Excellent. Okay. So this is the landing page, and actually I'm going to take a step back. So if you're not overly familiar with this, there's what's called the landing page or your home page, which gives you some overview of information, including your latest activities. Also over here to the left, you can click on patients, and it will give you a list of all of your patients. You can decide how many you want to see on that landing page. You can also filter the list, so you can look up a specific patient population or a specific group or an individual person. And that can make it a little bit easier, especially if you have a lot of patients that you don't want to just scroll through your entire view. So I'm going to choose this one right here. So you click on it, and it's going to bring up your basic dashboard. And so the dashboard gives you the overview of some of the analyses you've done with that particular person. So it gives you your latest first, and it usually populates the top 5 that you've done in the last. Also through here, you can input some data, so I can add. Now, if you're familiar with PhotoSmart or the Digital Pro, you know that you were using a mobile device to capture this information, to run through the analysis through the app. So I'm using the online version. It's a little bit more robust or detailed and easier to navigate through. I very quickly tend to show patients on my mobile device. I use a tablet mostly. Sometimes I use one of my my mobile phones. But when I do my review of findings with patients, especially the first time, I open up the app on my computer, so we can get a more detailed view. So you know that when you're collecting this information, that you can put some of this information in the patient profile, but know that you can edit the patient at a later date. You can add some more information as a result of some either changes, if you are making changes through the intervention process, rehabilitation, maybe you gave them an orthotic or something like that, then you can add that information into the patient profile. So I'm going to click on this particular activity right here. So it's going to populate this one specific analysis. And again, you can see that it presents with you a dashboard. So up at the top, it shows you what type of analysis we're looking at, which is a walk, run, or the newest one, which is the performance rehab module. It gives you a date stamp. So it tells you the date and the time that the analysis was conducted. And then it tells us that we're looking at the general view. I can also click and get the details view. We're going to start with the general view, so I will leave it there. And then you can also manipulate the type of view. So in this drop-down menu, you can choose neurological, traumatology, reathleticism. And what it does is it pulls out specific metrics and biomarkers instead of just showing all of them. You can also click on the custom view. And by clicking on the custom view, you can specifically choose which metrics will be viewable in your analysis. But I'm gonna leave them all so we can look at all of them. So as I said, we're gonna we're gonna start with the default view, and the default view gives me all of this information. So first off, this is an artificial intelligence and a machine learning and a deep learning algorithm that is used to generate this data. So the data is collected by your sensor. It is elevated to the cloud for computation, right? So it takes that all that aggregated information and it computes the metrics and the output that we see here in the analysis. And that's very different. So that's a very, as we call it, a curved linear approach, because it's not just us making assumptions on data points. And as a result of that, we can generate certain components to this output. One of them is going to be a color scheme. So you will see as you go through your analysis that we use certain color schemes to indicate if it is in the norm, right? So the normative data is either based on a population and or, meaning that on the population at which they fit, or it could be related to some of the patient demographics or anthropometrics, right? So a normative value could be based on age, right? So for example, how fast a patient might walk or a person might walk could simply be based on age. But what's different in our system is we use a curved linear algorithm through machine learning that we also look at some of the other anthropometrics, right? The measure of the patients, including their age, but also their height and things like that, which can help to dictate whether or not, for example, their speed is appropriate based on their age and their anthropometrics, but also like their cadence, right? Because a shorter person, their cadence or the number of steps that they take over that given time frame, their speed is going to be different if they're shorter versus taller. So what we see here is we see an orange and we see a red. So there's three color variations. If it's green, it means that it's in the normative values. If it's orange, it's on the either end of the normative values. So it's approaching a negative or a bad value, as we might say. And then if it's red, it's considered to be outside the normative values, and therefore we would want to specifically address that. So the reason having that color scheme is it makes it much easier for where my eyes need to go when I'm actually looking at that screen, so I don't waste time. So a lot of times, we add technology, but if we add more time in the evaluation process, it may not be efficient. and therefore it changes the benefit of performing certain things. Just as a note, that as we've been adding artificial intelligence into healthcare, and there's a big motivation to do that because it makes the potential diagnosis and therefore the management of patient conditions potentially more rapid, but also can enhance and do a better job at creating a diagnosis, especially as we move forward. And with a product such as the Digital Pro, is being able to do a better job at predicting potential problems even before they happen, which we know is going to be a very good thing because it therefore is going to reduce um, the future healthcare conditions and therefore also some of that future healthcare costs. Okay, so you also know that if you put your cursor over the question mark of a specific metric or biomarker, it gives you some information. So when I do it over symmetry, so symmetry is a really simple and easy basic characteristic, but it's a really important tool, right? Because as clinicians, you know that we are supposed to be not perfect, but somewhat symmetrical from side to side, right? So that can be a first indication that if you see a high degree of asymmetry, a very low number in symmetry, it means that there's a difference between the right and the left side. Now, at least initially, it doesn't tell us what the problem is, but the first thing, if I see that there's a high degree of asymmetry, then I already know that there is either an existing problem or there's going to be a future problem if that person is not experiencing any signs or symptoms of a condition. So we see here that we're at 91%. So that means there's a 91% symmetry in the contact time. So this particular characteristic is looking at contact time because that's one of the more important symmetry characteristics that we really want to take a look at. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. As we start to approach 10% difference between the right and the left, we get more concerned because that is an indication that there's an actual either condition or pathology. So we see that we're in the orange and we're getting close to that point. So at least when I see it in the orange, I'm gonna think about that. I'm gonna put it in the back of my mind as I continue to move through this. Then we see cadence, right? So cadence is the number of steps per minute, which is also going to be related to speed. And what we see here with cadence is they have a very reduced number of steps per minute. You'll also notice that it's showing you what's considered to be the normative standard, right? So we should be between 106 and 126. So what we see here is this person is relatively low. Now, keep in mind, this is an elderly patient, and that may actually make sense. We know that as people age, they do tend to walk slower. However, there may not be a reason for that. It could be just simply being sedentary, right? We do know that the elderly population does have the potential to walk at close to normal speed as a middle-aged adult or the average aged adult person. So let's move over to speed, and we see that speed is also in the red. So the average adult should be able to walk at approximately 3 miles per hour or about 5 kilometers per hour. Now, to me, that's actually really important on a couple of different levels. It says that for whatever reason, they're not walking to the appropriate speed. Now, there are a couple things you can think about here. One is when you are delivering the test, right, having the patient or person walk, you need to explain to them that they should be walking at a pace that they feel comfortable, that they want to go from one point to another point with intention, right? They're not in a hurry, but they want to get there as quickly as possible and as safely as possible without being in a hurry. And the literature shows us that that's about 3 miles per hour or about 5.1 kilometers per hour. So the reason I say that that's important to me is there's potentially a reason. Now, one, we'll see in the elderly population, a lot of times there's a fear of falling. right? So they don't want to walk too fast, right? And the reason is that when both feet are in contact with the ground, they're going to be more stable. As soon as they lift one foot to go into swing phase, now they're on one foot and they're not going to be as stable. They do not like to be unstable because they have a fear of falling. And that's one of the reasons they tend to walk slower. The other problem associated with that, even in just the general population, is um, and some of us use these measure devices like a Fitbit or a Garmin or an Apple Watch to measure our steps. And it's not just the number of steps, but it's the quality of steps. It's how fast you're actually moving. And so speed is a really good indicator of future health issues. Actually, it's also a prediction of morbidity and mortality. In other words, people that tend to walk slower, especially slower than 2.4 miles per hour, or about 4.5 kilometers an hour, have a higher rate of fatality as a result of walking slower because it's indicative of their overall health status. So now we can go down and we can look at the walking profile. So the walking profile breaks down the step and the stride length. So we can look at the time spent in stance phase, we can look at the time spent in swing phase, and we can look at the time spent in double support, meaning that that's the amount of time that we see both feet in contact with the ground. Now, the walking profile, the general view, doesn't show us the time, it shows us the relative percentages. So if you remember that, for example, in a normal gait pattern, the stance phase is about 60%, and the swing phase is going to be about 40%. So, as expected, we see that this person actually spends more time in that stance phase. The other thing that we see is the stride length. So, the stride length we see on this left is 27 inches, and we see on the right is 25 inches. And so that's a 2-inch difference. And that's one of the reasons why we're also potentially seeing some differences in symmetry in the contact stance, the contact phase, right? And so seeing those differences then starts to get you to think about, well, they seem to be reaching further on the left side than they do on the right side. So is there a problem? Now, I haven't told you a pathology yet. I didn't even tell you the age of the patient. So the age of the patient is 82 years old. And so just having a certain age-related demographic means that potentially this person's going to walk slower. So we do see a slower walk. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of background too. Patient has a history of knee osteoarthritis, bilateral, so both knees. Also a history of many falls, several falls, including 3 severe falls that resulted in hospitalization as well as fractures and concussion. Okay. So now you can see that that person probably has some issues and potentially has a fear of falling, which, like I said, is one potential reason that someone's going to walk a little bit slower. Now, I like to break this down a little bit more because we did see, as we're approaching that asymmetry, some of those differences. Now, you don't always have to do this. I mean, just looking at the walking profile and actually watching or visualizing the patient gives you some really solid information. We do see that the stride duration, right? That's how long they went from heel strike to toe off to heel strike on the other side. So that stride length relative to their speed, right, is really long, right? And again, that makes sense. They're not moving too fast, and they're pretty close between the two. Also, relative to the demographics of that particular patient, right, their height and age, we see that their stride length is really short. Okay. And again, you could see that visually. Well, why do I break this down? Well, when I use an intervention program on this patient, I want to see how they're progressing. And this is the kind of data that shows me, it shows the patient and the caregiver the changes that are occurring. So here is the swing phase, and we do see a difference between the time spent in swing phase on the right and the left. We see that the time spent in swing phase on the left is actually a little bit longer. And let's go back up and take a look. Well, it makes sense. They have a 2-inch longer stride length than they do on the right side. Okay. So that would make sense. They're going to be spending a little bit more
Chris, we
time.
don't see your PowerPoint anymore. We don't see your PowerPoint
You
anymore.
don't see my PowerPoint?
No.
Oh, someone must have clicked something. They took my share screen away. How about now? You can.
It's loading. Yes, now we can see it.
Okay. Sorry about that. Je m'excuse. Okay. So I think I left off when maybe you lost it when I was in the swing time. So we can see that the swing time is longer on that side. And then we see in the stance time that it's actually longer on the right side. And that's where we see that degree of asymmetry. So again, how can I use this information as I perform the intervention? So one is a lot of times stance time is going to be related to that stability issue. So we would potentially work on balance. Okay. Also, when we look at going into that swing phase or taking a longer step and longer stride length, oftentimes there's going to be some weakness associated with that in moving that leg into that swing phase. The other potential thing that we see with greater contact time is not only balance, but also when they come in contact and they absorb those ground reaction forces during a step, they can also be weakened. So very common, and I've used this as a case in my presentations, is that this person actually does have balance issues, and so we worked on balance. We also worked on strength of the quadriceps and the hamstrings. So she has the ability to capture herself, right? Because we look at walking as constant balance, unbalance, balance, unbalance. That's part of the characteristic of walking. And that is not something that someone who has a fear of falling likes to do. So improving that balance was a key component to making some of those changes. Let's look at the gait line here. So the gait line, this is the center of pressure as they're going through the contact phase. So this gives us, again, the percentage based on the average contact phase that someone should be spending, or excuse me, the average time frame, but breaks down the percentage based on the amount of time that that person actually spends in the various aspects of the gait line. So if you see here, the loading phase is on heel strike. The foot flat is when the toes have come down in contact with the ground. And then propulsion is going to be when they toe off, right, as that's late contact and then moving into early swing phase. And what we see here is a lot less time spent on loading and propulsion, right? And loading is usually the moment in time when people they're coming in contact with the ground, and that's when the fall usually occurs because of the weakness or the balance aspect. And there's not a lot of surface area coming in contact with the ground. So they quickly like to put their foot into foot flat position. And as you can see here, they're spending the majority of the percentage of time in foot flat position, also because they tend to be most stable in that particular position. Okay. Now I want you to look down here a little bit, and this is where part of this artificial intelligence aspect comes in from the machine learning platform of the algorithm, and it gives us some information, and it says that we're close to loading equally on both sides, but as we already saw that it's slightly abnormal. It tells you that there's a long foot flat position, short propulsion, and to look out for some of those other things that we're going to talk about here in a moment. And then let's move over to propulsion rate. So propulsion rate is and rate is an aspect of distance, divided by time. So it's an acceleration. So this is a ratio. It's a combination between the propulsion being generated by the plantar flexors, right, the gastrocnemius, the calf muscles, and the hip flexors that also create motion at the hip. So the combination of those two muscular activities generate the late propulsion phase from contact into the early swing phase of the gait cycle. And what we see here is the system generates and says, again, it's green and green, green and green. And it shows us that there's equitable muscle activity between those two groups of muscles that are going to initiate the swing phase. Now, what is very commonly seen in the older adult population is we will see a decrease in the activity of the hip flexors, and we see an increase in the activity of the plantar flexors. And sometimes when I see that earlier on, even before I suspect, an older adult patient may have be at risk for falling, is I take that into consideration because that actually indicates that that is a strategy that is common in the elderly population. And what that tells us is that they've lost some of their strength and ability in the hip flexors, which is also indicative or meaning that they could be losing some core stabilization. In any event, what they're doing is they're using a lot more propulsive force by the plantar flexors, and that's actually a component that could generate some off balance situation and lead them to an imbalance and change their center of mass, that they are no longer going to be stable. So I don't see that. I don't see that here. They're using it. They're using it equally, but let's see what else we see as we move forward. So I'm going to go back up to the
Chris,
hip. Yes,
Pavla is asking hip flexors or extensors.
it's hip flexors that are you. So this is into the propulsion phase. So this is late contact and early swing phase. So this is driving your leg forward, which is going to be the hip flexors. All right. So then I'm going to click on the details view. So the details view is a different set of data characteristics. And the first one we see are the pronation supination angles, or as sometimes we call it pronosupination. We just kind of shorten that term down. And so what this is the angle, right, of the foot on heel strike, on flat foot, on heel off, and on toe off. Okay. So again, you can quickly look at this. And when you see a negative angle, it means that the heel is going to be in an inverted position. And I'm going to talk about more why I say heel instead of pronosupination. But the heel is going to be on an inverted position. And if you see a positive angle, it means that the heel is going to be on an everted position. Now, keep in mind that the sensors are placed inside of the shoe. They're zeroed at the horizontal, which is why it's important that you have your patients walk on, if you want this characteristic, that you have the patients walk on a flat horizontal surface. So if you see it in the negative, it means that the heel is in an inverted position. If you see it positive, it means that the heel is in an everted or pointing out position. And I'll compare that to pronosupination here in a moment. As we already talked about, when you look at the coloration, we see that the average or the mean is going to be a numerical value, and that is also going to be placed within the normative data, which if it's in the red, it means that it's outside of what's considered to be normative. If it's in the orange, it's nearing outside. And if it's in the green, it's considered to be actual normal. So if you decide, you can just look at these real quick and you can make a decision whether or not you want to investigate this a little bit further. I see a lot of red, and so I want to take a further evaluation of this. So I'm going to click on the advanced view. So on the advanced view, what we see here is a graphical representation, and we call this the corridor. Now, I told you I was going to talk about the heel inversion, eversion relative to pronosupination or pronation supination. So remember that we've got a forefoot, a midfoot, and a rear foot at least. And so the position as the sensor as it's placed in the shoe, we're really more so looking at this as a block model. So really looking at the midfoot to the rear foot. So how the foot actually responds inside of the shoe, right? Which is different. If I'm looking at barefoot manipulation of the foot as it comes in contact with the ground, we know that the forefoot goes into a slightly different position than what we see in the heel foot. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about that. Now, people will say, well, it's about being barefoot. And it very much is. That tells us exactly what's going on with the foot at the various aspects of the foot. But in a shoe tells me how their trajectory of their foot is inside of the shoe. And that can be a further discussion later on. But as we see here, so people typically tend to heel strike, right, in a heel inverted position. And at the forefoot, we tend to see a relatively supinated position. Then as the foot comes down, the toes come in contact with the ground, we go closer to neutral. So the heel actually starts to move towards eversion, right? It's not doesn't necessarily go into eversion, but it's moving into less inversion and more to a neutral position. And then what we see in the forefoot is we do start to see some pronation in the forefoot, right? But you still see, and people will ask, well, I'm not at a zero angle. You're not, because again, we're looking at the foot as a foot model, a rigid model as it's coming in contact with the ground. And as we see, and we go into the heel off position. So typically in the heel off position, the foot may move into even less of a heel inverted position and may actually go into a heel everted position. So some people do go into a positive angle into that heel inversion. What we found in our corridor, again, relative to people wearing shoes, is this is the normal trajectory of the foot. What confuses people, I think, sometimes is that they say, well, that doesn't make sense that the foot actually moves into pronation on toe off. As you transition over to the first and second ray on toe off, the forefoot actually moves into a supinated position, right? While the heel moves into more potentially sometimes everted, and that's what confuses people. But our sensor is we're looking at the midfoot to the rear foot. Now you can look at the trajectory, and what you see on this particular patient is they tend to heel strike almost normal. They stay in a fairly neutral position. They go into a bit of a pronated or heel everted position. And then they roll back out and they tend to create a trajectory where they're not really toeing off on that first and second ray, you would think. But remember that this is going to be the position of the heel. So what happens is, as we saw in the center of pressure measure, is they were following a fairly normal trajectory, right? However, they stayed in that pronated position as we're seeing through this corridor. So their heel is actually going back into that position of the heel inverted position, and they're rolling out on the sides of their foot relative to that trajectory. Now we see on the right foot, it's actually quite different. And so their feet almost follow a mirror pattern, or excuse me, a symmetrical pattern, and they're not. They're supposed to be a mirror pattern, right? As you can see in this corridor right here. So the right foot actually follows a more normal trajectory. The left foot does not. Now, the other things to take into consideration, when you put your cursor over those points, right, and those are the points from heel strike, foot flat, heel off, and toe off, it gives you the actual numerical value. And then it gives you the standard deviation, which is the min and the max. It's actually not min max, it's actually the standard deviation. And so you get to see some of the variability. And that's what this black line is, the lighter black line on either side, right? The reason that that can be important is if there's no variability, that's actually not a good thing. It's not normal. We usually have some variability, right? So we don't see a degree of variability that goes down to zero. There should be some. When we see it too wide, right? And if it's too wide, then that's also indicative of an actual problem. And what you can see here is it's fairly consistent going through. And that kind of makes sense. If you think about this patient likes to spend a lot of time in foot contact, especially foot flat, they've really gotten used to that position. People that don't have really good balance, especially on propulsion or toe off, we tend to see a very wide standard deviation. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a strategy that we do see in the older adult population. And initially, at least, we tend to see a wider standard deviation in that propulsive phase position. So we do see that she might be able to use some correction here. And the reason I say that is not just because of her foot, but it might actually help her with her trajectory and affect her balance. So it could be an insert. There are certain products that you could potentially use to change that trajectory, but potentially use as a stimulation on the bottom of her feet to potentially help her balance position. Also related to how her foot is going to go through that cycle on, especially when she lands on heel strike and where she leaves on toe off, is this foot progression angle. So the foot progression angle gives us two characteristics. It gives us the degree of external rotation of the leg as a whole as it's moving through the swing phase, right? So that's how far the leg actually swings out or performs circumduction, right? And it's not just pure circumduction. There's a little bit of, as we flex the knee, you do get a little bit of rotation in the knee joint. But a lot of this, especially when they're walking slowly, is going to be circumduction. And we see that she's 1.1 and 0.8, close enough, not that big of a difference. When we have people that do not want to flex at the hip and the knee, they tend to have a very high degree of circumduction. So, for example, if the knee osteoarthritis was really causing a lot of pain, especially on knee flexion, she may not want to flex that knee. And instead of using just the knee flexion to create ground clearance, they will also create circumduction. So we see that circumduction is pretty normal on both sides. But what we also see, another way to create a trajectory is to not have the same length of the foot as it's going through the contact phase. So we see that she has an external rotation of 21.1 degrees, which is pretty excessive. So we normally see somewhere between 8 and 15 degrees or so. If you can imagine what that angle is, when someone is standing in normal posture, their toes externally rotate, or as a result of the hip, their toes point out about 8 to 10 degrees on average from that sagittal plane. And we see that this is pointing out very excessive on that one side. So this could actually be a result of the knee osteoarthritis, which in this particular patient is more excessive on that right side. So she does not like to flex and overextend that knee when she is going through the gait cycle. And that also makes sense because if you remember back, it was on the right side that we only had a 25-inch versus a 27-inch on the left side. So if they don't like to go into full extension at the knee, they do not tend to have as long of a step or stride on that particular side. And then we see on steppage and clearance, we see a reduced angle on toe off. We see a reduced angle on toe off on both the right and the left. These angles are actually pretty short. The 18 degree isn't bad, but again, remember that when I relate that back to what's going on with the hip external rotation, while she doesn't have to perform as much of a heel angle upon heel strike because she's got external rotation and not as much foot is coming in contact with the ground. It is reduced on that left side, so maybe we'll see a compensatory change happen, but that tells us that she's not really going into a lot of plantar flexion as she's going into the toe off, the early swing phase, the late stance phase, early swing phase. So that's reduced. And that's, again, if I had video to show you, you would see that walking with a very what we call a shuffling gait. So they don't tend to pick up their feet very much. And because they have such a short step and stride length, they don't reach out in front of them too far, right? Because they don't like to throw off their center of mass too much. They want a wide base of support, and that trajectory also wants to be very, very short. So they don't have to go into a big heel strike, and they don't need a lot of toe off to manipulate and produce a very, very short a short step or stride length. So again, the AI platform gives you some information. It doesn't tell you exactly what's wrong with the patient, so that's still up to you as the practitioner to figure some of that out. All right. So I don't have the follow-up on this particular screen, so I'm just going to go to another patient to show you another characteristic that we have in the system. So after you choose an analysis, you can do what's called the evolution. So the evolution allows us to track and look at multiple tests. This is just looking at 2 tests, but what it's able to show us is take all of that information and put it in a graphical representation. And I can see as the patient changed throughout the course of treatment, or this particular case was a single treatment pre and post, just to show the effect of shockwave. For example, it was a spinal cord injury patient who had a presentation very similar to cerebral palsy. So we can see the difference between these two. So the evolution is a really nice graphical representation. It allows me to show the patients the changes. And I found that this is very beneficial at getting patients to envision themselves and see what's going on. It improves overall compliance, which is a great thing, which also means that oftentimes we're going to improve patient retention. So it's not just an opinion, but it's graphical representation of their performance. Now, a lot of times people come in and it's because they're in pain. I try and remove people from that mindset, because pain is a symptom, and it can be abnormal in the case of making compliance and retention in patients, because if they think that when they're out of pain that they don't need treatment anymore, then they potentially will stop coming. And we know that they can have dysfunctional movement patterns even without pain. And so when we can remove them from that particular ideology. Now, also, when you do have one of these analyses up, over here to the left, you can do the comparison between just 2 analyses. You can also export the PDF. So when I click on export PDF, it will pull up, should pull up. Maybe we're locked. Yeah. Anyway, so it allows you to export a PDF, and you can print that PDF, email it, send it. You can input some of the information in there, and it allows you to share the information again with the patient, with another practitioner, maybe you're co-treating or referring them to, or the caregivers, to show that here's what's wrong with the patient, as well as some of the things that are changing as a result of the treatment effect, and whether or not they need to come in, or maybe they're going to be discharged. And all right, so I think we might have some questions.
Yes, there's a question again from Pavla. Is the PS graph a new PDF or not? Did they add it? Pronation supination graph.
Did they add a new graph in the I'm not sure I understand exactly what the question
She's
is.
asking if the graph shows in the PDF when we extract in PDF. Personally, I don't know because we just had a recent update and I haven't tested the PDF yet after the update. I'm not sure about you, Chris.
So let me see if I can pull up another patient and I can show you exactly what the.
Because Pavla says they were only numbers before.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I used to have to do a copy and paste.
You're not sharing your screen anymore, Chris. Huh?
Nope. My the app is frozen at the moment. So I'm trying to see if I can open up another view here. Bear with me. All right. All right. So this one, let me go back to. I don't have a walking on that. Let me hold on. All right, let me pull up. I'll share my screen here. Okay, so this is the view of the export of the PDF. Now, I think one of the things that was potentially missing is over here in the upper left-hand corner, if you don't click on advanced, you do not get the graph. You only get pronosupination angles. If I click on advanced, it actually does generate the graph. I believe, that's the graph you were looking for, Pavla?
So yes, Pavla says yes. This is what she
Okay.
was looking for.
Good.
There are a couple of questions from Leos. So first one, can I get some information about the jump mode, some prescriptions about differences of the different type of jump and the reasons and task of measurements of jump? Why is it necessary to analyze the jump?
So let me, sorry, I'll go back to sharing screen again. So there's a few reasons for the jump. So the initial reason for the buildup of the jump module was there's a criteria referred to as return to play, and so the return to play uses a lower extremity screening process. So these tests have been validated in field tests, and there's multiple tests to them. But for example, let me pull up the side hop here. So the side hop is a 30-second test, and they go across 15 centimeters. So you can see the example right here. So the reason for these tests, these are specifically validated for return to play or return to sport for ACL injury. It's also been validated more recently in the last 5 to 10 years for other things, such as overall lower extremity performance, related to post-injury and recovery from injury. Historically, what we've only seen was just the outcomes data, which is the amount of jumps that they had in 30 seconds, and you would compare both sides. But what we've been able to accomplish is now we actually get the average flight time. We also get the average contact time between the two. So we're able to get more performance related characteristics of those jumps for a little bit more detail, as well as the contact orientation. So let me put you on the advanced view. And you can see that we get flexion on takeoff, we get propulsion velocity, we get jump height, we get rotation around Z. So some of these characteristics I know some people are not going to be familiar with because initially those were considered to be field tests. Now, some of us that had a laboratory, we could test them on a force platform and use motion analysis and things like that. But now you're going to be able to use the same system to get a lot more detail as to the overall performance characteristic between these two. So, for example, if we have an ACL injury and they have surgery, the reoccurrence rate is pretty high if it happens in a young person. So a lot of that has to do with other characteristics, potentially could be some weakness, but for example, rotation around the Z-axis, that's similar to the progression. So that's the orientation of the foot on the Z-axis. Now, as you increase the degree of external rotation, especially on landing, that results in an increased valgus position of the knee joint, which puts them in a very risky position for an ACL injury, right? So now we're able to actually capture a lot more characteristics on very validated tests that otherwise we weren't able to accomplish. In addition to using the video, I also get the visual that I can either put into another system to look at some of the angles or just have a visual to be able to show the patients how they actually look when they jump or hop.
Thank you, Chris. There's another question by Elias. Please let me know about the photo mode. I start testing the video mode. Please let me know how can I attach any photos about my patient's walk or run, foot, etc.
So we can't do that just yet. So you would actually have to, you know, take a screenshot. Which if I do that on the computer, I can take a screenshot. Or if I'm on my mobile, I can take a screenshot. So you can play the video to the point where you want to stop, and you can actually stop that. And then you can either take a screenshot on your system or a screenshot on your mobile device. You cannot attach that to your PDF export yet, so you would have to send that as a separate file at the moment.
Do we have other questions? So Elias is typing something. Okay, he's just thanking us. I don't know if somebody else has any question. Okay, since I don't see any questions coming, I'm just gonna tell you a few things. I'm gonna ask the questions.
Go for it.
So if you could see down on the polls tab, I have asked a few questions. Thank you. Some of you have already answered them. It's just for us to get to know you better and to see if there's something we can do. I see that Nurit is typing something, which is maybe a question or a comment. So she's thanking us. And I would like to ask you, I'm going to just post here a small link for an evaluation form. So if you could fill this evaluation form, we will be very thankful. And I will just add our email here. So you can email us in order to request a certificate of attendance. And please don't forget that we're going to do this webinar on the second Thursday of every month. Okay, you could go on our dashboard on our company page and register for any webinar that is interesting for you. I will post here the link to the company page and the email that you can send us.
Yes, and I love to see interesting cases.
You have some questions also, you could send them by email to the same email, education@digital.com, or to me or to Chris, and I will gladly forward them to Chris, who will gladly answer them as well.
Yes.
So as I think there's one more question. Okay, from Ramsey. Will the jump model measure data on doing a hurdles race over 10 hurdles, and can that be broken down into parts?
I wish it not now, but so we have some ideas for the future, but right now the tests have to be very well defined. And so what I found in playing around with the Digital 2.0 is I've been able to do some high speed running, which is pretty cool, and it's actually been able to capture some various like hopping and skipping, but it's not designed for that right now, so it's not really gonna give you the exact data. And because part of the problem will be when you're running like that, even when you're looking at the analysis and you click on the point, right? So it's an aggregate of about 15 seconds, so point by point, and so therefore you're not going to get very specific contact time yet. But as you saw in my side hop view, we are able to capture specific point by point. So if we can blend at some point in the future, if we can blend that, then that would be interesting to be able to capture point by point in sprinting and hurdling. But right now, we do not have that. But with this new system, we're able to do a lot more, as I say, really cool stuff.
Laios is typing something. I've added our emails here, and I've added the link to access our page on Livestorm where you can register for future webinars. And I have added previously the link to the evaluation form. Thank you, Laios. He's just thanking us, and
yes.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris. And we look forward to your feedback, and we look forward also to seeing you in future webinars. It's gonna be on the second Thursday of every month, and every time Chris is gonna be considering a different case or a different pathology and going deeply in some parameters. Maybe at one point going deeply into the jump analysis. So whatever you request, we are ready here for it. If you would like to share a certain patient or a certain case with Chris so that he will go into details in a future webinar, we would also look forward to that.
Rana, Chris, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Rana.
Thank you,
Everyone
everybody.
have a great evening.
Great evening to everybody. Bye-bye. Take care.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
great evening to you all. Bye.